Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this New Fleet Europe webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome you today. We are going to have a great session. You also reacted massively to our invitation, which of course is always pleasant. So it also means that the topic of today really gains traction among you and your businesses, and it should. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar is supported by ALD Automotive and ChargePoint, and they are also our expert speakers of today. As you will see immediately, what is the topic? And the topic of today is about how to create efficiency in 2022, and we all know that to create efficiency you probably have some important cost savings targets, but at the same time you also have some sustainability goals, and sometimes matching both cost savings, fleet efficiency on the one hand, and sustainability and fleet electrification on the other can be a challenge, but not to our expert speakers, because they will detail that it can be a perfect match for your fleet strategy. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today Amélie de Valroger. She is the head of business intelligence and consultancy at ALD Automotive, and she will present together with Frederic Wagner, who is the manager fleet partnerships at ChargePoint. Amélie and Frederic, welcome to this webinar. I hope that you are doing well.
Perfect. Thank you, Steven.
Well, it's great that you can be here. As I mentioned already, there are quite some people interested in the topic, and they should be, because otherwise we won't have organized this webinar. What are we going to do? Well, Amélie and Frederic, they will do first a joint presentation. And after that, there will be time for Q&A, like we always do. If you have a question for one of the expert speakers, the only thing that you need to do is submit your question via the tool. So you can send your question, and at the end of the webinar, I will moderate a Q&A together with our expert speakers. So I am ready to listen to the story of Amélie and Frederic. I hope you too. And so I give the floor to Amélie.
Thank you, Steven. We know that in 2022, sustainability is at the top of your agenda. Together with my colleague Fred, we are going to show you that sustainability and cost optimization, which may seem contradictory at first, can go hand to hand. And we are going also to demonstrate how with fleet electrification done right, you can achieve these two objectives at the same time. You perfectly know that the temperature of our planet has never risen so fast. This unprecedented change is caused by the greenhouse gases emission, mostly CO2 and methane. According to all recently climate-related reports, we can't wait. We need to act now. Governments have taken some ambitious targets across the globe to reduce their CO2 emission. Burning fossil fuel, the technology we use in the transport sector today, creates most of these emissions. But companies also contribute to the fight. Indeed, fleet can represent up to 50% of your internal emission, according to industry and business models. Companies, like probably yours, have taken sharp commitment to decrease in their direct and indirect emission. As a consequence, your main priority in 2022 is to apply this internal CSR target to the mobility area and define your own sustainable mobility strategy to meet your climate goal.
Thanks, Amélie. Thanks for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone who's in the audience. So as Amélie mentioned, companies are also looking at sustainability because companies are, through their fleets, for example, contributing to these emissions. So I'd like to talk about how sustainability becomes quantifiable, measurable within organizations first. Emissions are measured across the entire company. And what you'll see if you look at an annual report for a company is that they're broken down into scope emissions. So you have scope 1 emissions, for example, the emissions that are directly caused by your fleet. You'll have scope 2 emissions, for example, from your utilities energy mix, and scope 3 emissions from your supply chain. Now, as a fleet manager, you can directly influence scope 1 emissions, for example, by pursuing a path of electrification. And we'll show you in the coming slides how that's possible. However, we can also optimize scope 3 emissions, for example, by installing electric infrastructure at your office locations so you can make it easier for your supply chain partners to make that switch. If they know that they can charge at your locations, that'll make it possible. So on this slide, you'll see that the question is no longer if electrification is coming, but when and how fast it is. How fast. So there's a number of inputs that are coming into play that are really creating this perfect transition. First, as I'm sure you all know, because I'm speaking to many fleet managers across Europe, there's a lot of employee pressure. Not only because employees want to contribute themselves and have a positive impact on sustainability, but some of the coolest cars coming onto the markets, whether it be sports cars, vans, SUVs, even pickup trucks, for example, in the US are now becoming electric. So your customers, your fleets are asking for these vehicles. As we'll show in the coming slides, carbon footprint reduction programs are also important in this transition, trying to optimize sustainability and achieve those emission reduction goals. As I said, there's a lot of new vehicles coming into the market, but at the same time, there's a lot of vehicles that are also being phased out. Many manufacturers, as I'm sure you've already heard, have decided to remove diesel engines from their portfolios in the coming years and petrol vehicles as well. So that means by 2030, 2035, depending on the geography, many types of combustion engines may no longer be offered. Next, but definitely very important, are the tax benefits for both employees and employers. So for example, in Germany, if you install a home charging station, you get up to a 900 euro tax credit. Similarly, you can avoid taxes by operating a fully electric fleet. On the fuel cost topic, unfortunately, I think we're all aware of the current geopolitical tensions, especially in Europe, and fuel costs are rising. I think if we look at oil and natural gas costs in the last few months, there's been a dramatic increase, which is going to have a direct impact on your TCO calculation for your electric fleet. And finally, low emission zones are here. I think the most prominent example is London. Anybody that's trying to drive into downtown London without an electric vehicle knows that you're paying upwards of £20 just to go there for the day. So if you're operating a fleet, whether it be your salespeople on the road or your vehicle delivery van fleet, they need access to these urban centers, and those regulations are only going to get tighter. If we go to the next slide, please. So as we go through this presentation, Amélie and myself are very excited to show you how sustainability can go hand in hand with cost savings. And as a fleet manager, the task of lowering emissions across your organization with all these new changes could sound complicated and expensive. Furthermore, traditionally, fleet managers have only needed to think about the vehicle itself and the fueling of that. But you'll see the puzzle piece on the right here is something very new to many of you. Infrastructure now goes hand in hand and is a crucial element in you achieving your sustainability goals and planning that total cost of ownership for your fleet. So in the coming slides, we'll be looking at these two important elements, these two pieces of the puzzle that will help drive your electrification. And with that, I'll hand back to Amélie.
Thank you, Fred. And to achieve your CSR target, we have one certainty. The future of mobility is electric. A lot of people need a car to commute, to work, and to travel. And this won't drastically change in one day. Electrification is the key enabler to make an impact on environment today. As explained by Fred, electrification follows a S-curve. The question is not anymore if the electrification is going to happen, but how fast the electrification will be. Corporate fleet will be ahead of the curve because they have younger cars than the general market. So it's in our power to accelerate the uptake. We can see that the trend has started to accelerate in 2020, which was the breakthrough year for both BEVs and FEVs. It has started in Western European countries, but this trend is spreading rapidly thanks to regulation and tax incentives. So now that you know that the electrification is the main solution concretely, how should you electrify your fleet at a good price? We all know that electrification is more than just ordering an electric vehicle. So our goal with ChargePoint is to give you the best support you need to make your transition simple and accessible, and to achieve your corporate objective in terms of TCO and CO2. They are not contradictory at all. So to support your transition, we have developed a 5-step methodology in co-creation with our strategic client, starting from the fleet analysis, marketing intelligence, and benchmarking, to the follow-up support on change management and KPIs monitoring. This methodology answers to all the legitimate questions you may have. Where should I start my energy transition and at which pace? For which drivers? How much it will cost, and what internal rules for my organization? And again, what tools to monitor and keep optimizing my electrified fleet. So let's focus on our step 3 on CO2 output and TCO modeling, and Fred will present our step 5 on follow-up and operation. So let's answer to your first legitimate question. Where should I start my energy transition, and at which pace, and what impact on my CO2 emissions? A lot of customers, like David here, come to me and say, my organization commits to be carbon neutral in 2030. They want to have electric vehicles everywhere starting next year. Where do we do that? At which pace should I transition? Which country should be prioritized, and how to calculate my CO2 emissions? Our solution? My Net Zero program. This is a methodology we have developed with you. So we provide David with a baseline of CO2 emission here in 2021. And then we model the CO2 emission projection based on your fleet data and the reality of the market. Car deliveries, contract life cycle, CO2 targets, the integration of green vehicles based on 3 scenarios, gradual, moderate, or accelerated. And based also on EV maturity scoring system, which scores the maturity of countries toward electrification, based on OEM offer, for instance, tax and regulation incentives, infrastructure network, and even source of energy use. On this example, the projection shows a decrease of 93% of its CO2 emission. My Net Zero program is a simple and impactful program which allows you in 1 week to get, like David, another plan per year, per powertrain, and per country, and the impact on your carbon footprint. So now you know which powertrain to select when renewing your fleet. One of the main barriers of electrification is the cost. That's legitimate. You don't want to increase them. And what a complex matter for you. So coming back to the basics, to compare ICE vehicles with electric vehicles, you need to adopt a total cost of ownership approach. If you just compare monthly rental, you won't get a fair comparison as the investment price is higher for EVs. So in that case, you compare Apple and peers. If you want to compare apples with apples, you have to add taxes, incentive, energy consumption, and home charger and charging costs. This is the full TCO, what we call the full TCO. The real TCO is the TCO you are going to pay at the end of the month. And the predictive one, the predictive TCO, is just a forecast to prepare your budget, which need to be close to the reality. The TCO is a complex notion which brings many challenges. Consistency across the market, evolution of taxation, predict fuel energy consumption based on where you are going to charge, how you drive, what is your payload, the weather condition, and for PHEV, how often do you charge it? So our objective is to make it simpler and clearer for you. So to do so, we have adopted one single definition across all the markets. We use it for our quotation and missions. This definition encompasses monthly rentals, energy consumption with uplift based on driver behaviors, direct and indirect taxes and incentive, charging cost, but also fringe benefit for the employees. So with this approach, some clients are surprised to see that greener alternatives have reached TCO parity or even are cheaper than ICE vehicle in some markets. This calculation methodology, consistent across our market, provides you with a comprehensive decision-making basis for your optimal vehicle selection. And to make the TCO and CO2 even more simple and accessible, we have built a new app called the Green Scorecard, co-created with our strategic clients. We can assess with you the TCO for you and your employees, and also the CO2 impacts. You can benchmark one vehicle with greener alternative, but also make projection for your entire fleet. With a theoretical approach, but also a realistic forecast of your future TCO and CO2, including, as I explained, the driver behaviors. So this tool is available in France and in the Netherlands and will be rolled out in major countries in Europe in 2022. Our clients love it, and one of our clients in the pharma industry said that it's one of the best innovation he has seen in a while. So Fred, I'll let you comment the step number 5.
Thanks, Amélie. So now we're shifting from the electric vehicles themselves and planning that fleet electrification plan to the infrastructure. So now that your fleet is electric, now you need to optimize the use. And what does optimizing use look like? In the past, you had the vehicle and you had the fueling of that vehicle, so perhaps a fuel card or a company credit card, and your fueling needs, your energy needs were fulfilled. With EVs, since electricity is pervasive and it's all around us, fueling can also take place in many different locations, whether it be at home, at work, at the depot, or on the road at a public charging station. So the first step to optimizing use and the cost of charging your electric vehicles is managing your data and understanding where your vehicles are being charged. Only if you have access to which drivers, how many drivers, where they're charging, whether public or at home or at work, how many home installations have taken place, will you be able to understand and make informed decisions about incentivizing the type of cost behavior and charging behavior you'd like to see in your fleet. Home charging is something completely new when it comes to EVs. I don't think many people had a diesel or a petrol pump at home, so having a fueling station in your garage will be something new for both you as a fleet manager, but also for your drivers. This is also home charging, the first example where infrastructure becomes directly attached, directly relevant in that TCO calculation for your fleet drivers. So I'd like to dive a little bit deeper now into infrastructure and how specific aspects of the infrastructure can really help you meet your sustainability goals with keeping that cost savings in mind. So if you could go to the next slide. What you're seeing here are a number of features, but It's not about the features, it's about the concept behind this. EV infrastructure can only be managed efficiently if it's networked, if it's connected to the internet. The reason for that is because a number of the behaviors, the cost optimizations that you will want to pursue and implement are only possible if you have that type of connectivity. So let's start with features like access control. This is a direct way to reduce Scope 3 emissions. Access control means deciding who, when, where, and to which conditions can access your charging infrastructure. For example, if you're operating a manufacturing facility and you're trying to decrease your Scope 3 emissions, you can incentivize your suppliers to use electric vehicles when delivering goods to your office or your manufacturing facility by granting them access to charging stations on site. Pricing. It may sound superficial, but pricing is a huge way to reduce Scope 1 emissions. For example, you procure 100% green electricity for your office locations. Imagine if you then set a very attractive price or incentivize your drivers to then charge at the office. Not only is the fuel then completely green, but you're also charging EVs, so a significant reduction in Scope 1 emissions. The next piece, reporting. Reporting is important because it lets you see how charging stations are being used, because utilization is one of the main factors to look at when planning your infrastructure investment. Knowing how your stations are utilized will help you understand if you need to make decisions like integrating a wait list. So many charging stations, if you just install a hardware, just a simple AC charging station, for example, someone will show up in the morning and plug in their electric vehicle. They'll be blocking that station for 8 hours if they have no incentive to leave. So that means you made one investment for a charger that's only producing one charging session per day. If you use smart charging to perhaps remind that driver after 3 hours when his charging is complete to move his vehicle, you can actually generate 2 to 3 times as many charging sessions on the same asset per day. So that's exactly how you save cost while still achieving your sustainability goals of charging electric vehicles. And finally, it's about the driver experience. Your customers, your users, if everything from the hardware to the software to the RFID card, the customer service they interact with when it comes to charging isn't excellent, you're going to hear it first as the fleet manager. So I'd like to now, on the next slide, talk a little bit more about energy management. When it comes to me, I think energy management is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of cost savings with infrastructure. Of course, your connectivity and your charging solution will show you how you save greenhouse gas emissions. You'll understand the energy mix in their local country or market. If it's pure renewable, every charging session that your infrastructure produces directly avoids greenhouse gas emissions because the alternative would be diesel or petrol consumption in that vehicle. Now let's double click on energy management. Energy management, simply put, is about intelligently managing the available electric capacity at your locations. This comes in many forms. It could be shaving peaks, it could be tracking power consumption, it could be charging when electricity is cheaper, for example, at night. But at the end of the day, it's about saving energy and lowering electricity costs. On the next slide, I'd like to give a concrete example of this. And bear with me because this can get complicated, but it's a very important example of how software, charging infrastructure, and coordinating your fleet can save you money. So let's start with the graph on the left. What you're seeing here is a customer with a 50 vehicle delivery fleet. On the x-axis, you see the time of day going from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. the following day. And on the y-axis, on the left, you see kilowatt. So that's the power consumption of this site, the electricity consumption. And on the right, you see the electric vehicle, the number of vehicles in the depot. So looking at this graph, you see that orange line starts to pick up at 6 p.m. That means that's when the vehicles are arriving at the depot. If this were an office building, perhaps that's 9 a.m. when everyone starts getting to work. At the same time, simultaneously, you see those blue bars increasing at the same time. That means the vehicles are being plugged in when they get to the office. What that means is when all 50 vehicles are at the office and charging, at 10 p.m., you have a peak power draw of 1.6 megawatts, 1,600 kilowatts. That's a huge amount of energy consumption there. What you'll see is that the vehicles stay into the depot, so that orange line remains high until about 4 a.m. That's when the vehicles start leaving and going on their daily routes. However, you'll also notice that the charging, that blue line, decreased to about 0 at 2 a.m. That means there were actually 4 hours where the vehicles weren't even charging there. So what do we do? And why is energy management here? Let's move to the picture on the right. And there's two things that are important here. You'll see the peak demand cost between 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock. As everyone knows, when you get home from work, the kids are watching TV, you're cooking dinner, the stove is on, the oven's on, energy consumption in the entire grid increases dramatically. And that's also why the utilities charge more for electricity. So it's more intelligent to start charging when you get into a cheaper window for electricity prices. It's the same reason why many of us operate our washing machines or dryers at night, to save costs by using that cheap evening electricity costs. The next part is about putting a maximum level on the site power draw. You'll see that those blue bars never go beyond 800 kilowatts in this case, which is half as much as on the unmanaged charging scenario on the left. That translates directly into cost savings because your utility doesn't have to provide you that demand. They know there's never going to be more than 800 kilowatts, and that's cheaper. So at the end of the day, you'll see that energy management can help you avoid demand charges. It can shift charging to times when electricity is cheaper, and you can schedule charging so that the vehicles are ready when you need them, not necessarily as soon as possible. You'll see that immediate isn't always better, and in this case, it saved the customer $350,000 per year. So let's go to the next slide, and I'd like to talk on one final example of how charging, infrastructure management, and having the transparency on the both of those can help you achieve your sustainability goals and save costs. So for you as a fleet manager, the cheapest place for your drivers to charge their vehicles will obviously be at your depots or workplaces. Why? Because you're using a commercial utility rate there. The second cheapest place for your drivers to charge will be at home, because they're using their residential electricity rate. The most expensive place for your drivers to charge is on the road at public charging stations. So there's many high-power DC fast charging networks that are very important, but they also charge up to 90 cents, for example, per kilowatt hour. So it's very important as a fleet manager when someone comes and asks, okay, what is the average cost, or what's the average kilowatt hour cost of our fleet, to understand exactly where these drivers are charging. If all of your drivers are always charging in public, you could really optimize that cost by, for example, installing some workplace charging. Second, as I mentioned before, you can have a green energy tariff at your workplace locations, and that's a great way of not only reducing Scope 1 emissions for your fleet itself, but also making sure that you're fueling those vehicles with renewably created energy. As you'll see, lower emissions and lower cost, sustainability, and cost savings. So to wrap things up on the final slide, I'd like to start by saying thank you, both from ALD and from ChargePoint. We hope that you see making the switch to electric vehicles can be made simple and accessible if you have an end-to-end solution. But it's not only about the products. It's not only about the infrastructure or the vehicles. It's about having that energy transition advisory support, having experts that know the business both on the infrastructure and the vehicle side. Companies like ALD and ChargePoint can accompany you there. We'll help you achieve your CO2 reduction plan, put you on a path to electrification with tools and knowledge that we have directly in-house. We hope you see that sustainability and cost savings can go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Frederic. Thank you, Amélie, for the great presentation and enlightening us about the way that we can realize cost savings and go for sustainability. Now it's time for our Q&A. To the audience, if you have questions, and I'm sure that you have questions for our expert speakers, you can submit your questions via the chat. We will start with our Q&A. First question, probably to Amélie. There was a question of Stéphane Denis, and the question is related to the TCO overview, the TCO box that you presented. And Stéphane is saying, well, you did not clearly mention in that TCO box the RVs, while RVs are key in the lease rate. I'm assuming that probably those RVs are calculated in the lease rate. But secondly, related to that, he also asks, can you elaborate a little bit on the evolution of RVs from EVs compared to ICE vehicles? Do you see an evolution in there?
So answering to the first question first, of course, RV are part of the monthly price box I mentioned, together with services, tires, maintenance, and insurance, for instance. So this is the building blocks, and with our methodology, we can show you the breakdown, of course. Answering to the second question, evolution of RV, it's a really challenging, question, and I think nobody has a clear answer on that. Nobody knows perfectly how RV of EV, PHEV, and hybrid vehicles are going to evolve. And what I can answer is that it's challenging to determine them, and we try to to gather all the data we can have to determine the best RV possible and to make projections.
Okay, very good. We continue. Frederic, of course, the final part of your presentation was highly interesting. There are a few questions related to that. Perhaps to start, you were emphasizing that energy management is really important and that you see value in energy management. Why do you think that we are not yet using all energy management? What is the key obstacle today?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you to the person that asked that. So I think if you look at the way electrification has developed, it's been a very, very gradual curve over the past 10 years. I mean, I think the first vehicles came into the market, there's pictures of EVs back in the 1900s. It's not a new technology, but it hasn't really gotten to scale until now. So what that means is that there have been a lot of companies that began, quote unquote, dabbling with electrification a number of years ago. They were simply deploying maybe 1 or 2 stations and thought that it was a problem that you could solve by installing hardware and then installing more and more hardware. And there wasn't really the concept of putting a software layer on top of that hardware to optimize it. So I think it's simply a fact that the industry wasn't mature enough. And what we're seeing now with this hockey stick that Amélie was showing in her electrification transition guide is that these vehicles are coming now and they're coming quickly. So the TCO, the value of that energy management just got a lot bigger because people are realizing, wow, I have a significant investment that I have to make on infrastructure, and now the return on that energy management investment is there.
Okay. To follow up, a question from Ajay Srivastava. What do you think will be the optimal number of charge points? I can imagine that many people, many fleet managers have that question. What is the optimal number of charge points at the depot level for a fleet of roughly 150 EVs? Is there a guideline to give?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Ajay. And it's somewhat a question of how long is a piece of string. It depends, but I'll give you some things to think about when you are planning that. First and foremost, it depends on the operation of those vehicles. So how long are they parked? How long are they going to be at their location? And when do they need to get going again? So ChargePoint offers, for example, AC, DC, low power charging, high power charging, And we never begin a discussion with a customer saying you absolutely need DC or AC charging. The first thing we do is, how do you use those vehicles and when do they need to be on the road again? So for workplace charging, where employees are at the office all day, 8 hours, it's fine if those vehicles charge in 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. But if you're operating a fleet of, for example, grocery delivery vehicles that are constantly going into the depot and out of the depot many times per day, perhaps they're only parked for 20 minutes, so high-powered DC charging is the best solution. So if you say you have a fleet of 150 vehicles, it depends. Are those vehicles that are parked all night overnight? Or are those vehicles that are going around in different routes and need to be charged quickly? So I suggest you get in touch with a company that can, look at your local situation, and then you'll get the most efficient infrastructure recommendation there. Because the last thing you want to do is overinvest in infrastructure that you don't necessarily need.
Okay. A practical question, I think, to Amélie. Amélie, a question from Roberto Cortes Rodriguez. Can I order the electric analysis to my ALD regional account manager, or who do I need to contact?
So you can contact the team here at central level, but also we have, point of contact in every country with ALD. So you can contact your ICAM or CAM in the country, and you can get, the answer.
Okay. A question in terms of EV driver profiling, I think. You mentioned that is key to track charging habits, to optimize energy costs, etc. What can fleet managers do proactively? So prior to give battery electric vehicles to the drivers, how to capture best practices, and what can they do already upfront? Someone?
Yeah, I can take it first, and Fred, don't hesitate to comment if you want. Yeah, of course, driver behavior and analysis needs and usage of the driver. It's a key step of electrification process, electrification transition. So first, we need to analyze this driver needs and to offer to our employees the best solution which fits to this, to this needs and usage. So we can, provide BEV to all the employee, but some of them can't charge at home, for instance, or at the office. So it won't, be possible for them. So based on daily mileage, their usage, if they are client facing and have different, meetings, if they are doing, a long distance for their private, usage, based on all these, elements, and also, of course, the possibility to charge at home or at the office, we provide the best solution for them. That's the first thing. And then also what we recommend to our client is to, put some specific clear rules in the car policy. That really, really important. An example. So if you integrate PHEV in your car policy, our recommendation is to put a threshold on the usage of the fuel card in order to limit the usage of fuel and to drive your car as much as possible as an electric car. So again, an example. But we need to try through the car policy and all the different, process we have to put in place, also in the, vehicle and charging selection process, different, guidelines to, guide our employee to the best solutions and to the best usage.
Okay. Frederic, I think it was you that related to EV charging. You mentioned incentivizing the desired type of charging behavior. How do we need to imagine that? Can you make this more concrete? What can a fleet manager do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's you start doing that analysis by breaking it down into those three buckets of charging types that I'd referenced. So you have home charging, workplace charging, and public charging. I saw there was another question in that direction as well, so I'll try to combine both of them. public charging is the most expensive way because it's a public setting that asset owner needs to recoup their investment and pay the electricity cost and try to make some money on the way. So it's obviously a lot of margin stack going on there. So I think when it comes to AC charging, you'll be spending, depending on the market in Europe, 40 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour charging AC. And on DC, you'll get up to 90 to €1 per kilowatt hour. At the workplace, you're talking commercial electricity rates, which vary in Europe from maybe 10 cents to 20 cents per kilowatt. And at home, you're maybe 15 to 30 cents. So you have those different ranges. And if you have a software tool, for example, something like what ChargePoint offers, you can look in there and you see the exact charging split per driver. So you'll see, obviously, a driver who has a home charging station. And if you offer workplace charging, about 80%, based on our data, about 80% of that charging is going to be at home and at the workplace, and then 20% in public. And you look across your driver, and if you see that, you look across your scheme and you see that there's one driver who's perhaps, or a group of drivers, your sales reps that are charging 80% in public, and that's a huge cost driver. That's where you can go in there and start asking questions like, would it make sense to install a home charging station for you? Is there a reason you're not charging at the office, etc.? So you can really save, fourfold per kilowatt hour if you just direct your charging to those locations. One final point there on charging at the office, because the question I'm getting a lot now is, especially for customers in urban settings, is, okay, I have many people that live in flats, and you can't install charging stations in the parking garage in the basement there. So they're dependent on public charging if they have an electric company car, electric vehicle. Perfect solution for that, to avoid that expensive public charging, which adds up very quickly if they're doing that every night, is to install workplace charging at the office. So those are the kind of analyses that you can look at the driver groups, see where they're charging, and then start to fine tune that as you gain experience.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, so there were a few other questions related to that. Mark de Vos of Coca-Cola was mentioning, where do you see eventual savings for EV cars, for sales reps, etc., that are not going to the office and perhaps don't have, let's say, the opportunity for a home charger? Is it then almost logic and mandatory that they will charge public?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I can look just within my own organization. So ChargePoint, we obviously have an office here in Munich where I'm located, but we have sales representatives all across Germany and the respective markets, and many of those work entirely remote. If they have a home charging station, that's where they're going to start their sales trip day with a full charge, and that's good, valuable energy and not an expensive public charging rate. I think if you look at someone who is in that setting but doesn't have a home charging station, yes, they're going to be dependent on public charging. And I think that's exactly where the kind of driver analysis that companies like ALD can help you with. Is this the best vehicle for this driver at this time, given his kilometer, given his behavior profile, to make that calculation. I think you'll see that even I said it was expensive public charging, but even if you consider the total bucket, I mean, let's recall Amélie's slide there, that total value stack of everything that goes into that analysis. Even if you do that with pure public charging, I think that break even, that TCO breaking point between EVs and combustion engines is getting very close. So I think in the coming years, it's not going to be an issue, even if you have a 100% public charging driver.
Okay, good. Linked to that, which countries have the most prominent or best tax incentives for electric cars and hybrid vehicles in Europe? Can you give us some kind of insight into that? We all think about Norway, the Netherlands.
Yeah, you have also the UK, now France, Germany as well, and it's also push a lot the growth last year and probably this year as well. So mainly mature country, but as I explained, we have also this tax regulation incentive are also spreading in other countries, and even in a country like LATAM, US. So it's not only the matter of mature country anymore.
Okay, and for
and if
those...
you want to have details on, if you want to have details on that, don't hesitate to look at our mobility guide or to contact us, because we can go deep details for every country.
Okay, and the same goes for us. I even think that that ebook, I'm looking at my colleague, was supported by ALD. We have an EV incentives ebook that has just been published, and so you can also find it on our website, fleeteurope.com, with an overview of the new tax incentives for electric vehicles in 12 European markets. Let's continue. There is a question from Ramon Cano, from Philip Morris. How can you fairly reimburse electricity to employees when they charge their cars at home? Is there a system that you can recommend? Is there, let's say, best practice that you can elaborate on?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Ramon. Thank you for that. And yes, there is a solution that, for example, ChargePoint offers. It's called our Home Energy Reimbursement Service. So for those drivers in your fleet that do have a home charging station, that's directly connected to your management solution of those drivers. So every single home energy session that those drivers produce, you'll see in your system as an energy cost. Just like it was in the age of fuel cards, your drivers obviously won't want to be paying for their business mileage themselves, so you'll want to invoice that to the company. So what we do is, when that station is installed, the driver puts their own home energy tariff, so let's say in Germany, 28 cents per kilowatt hour, into the app. They also put their bank account information there for reimbursement. So what happens is that at the end of every month, you get an invoice for that driver's home charging, for example, 80 euros for their monthly charging, and we reimburse that driver those 80 euros. And we do that on a kilowatt hour exact level for a number of reasons. Many companies just recommend doing a standard stipend that is, a bulk amount for reimbursement. But I would definitely not recommend that. You want to get as close as you can to a kilowatt hour exact reimbursement, because then it's auditable. There's no benefit in kind tax implications you need to look at there. So to answer your question, what we do is we figure out what the cost of that home energy is, and then we reimburse that driver one-to-one for the company.
Okay. A question related to the contract, the duration and the mileage. We all know that when we have a company car, we have an ICE vehicle in leasing, that normally it's around 4 years. It's 120,000 kilometers on those 4 years. It's around that, depending on the mileage that you do for business and for commuting. Is there a recommendation in terms of the use of an electric vehicle? For example, here it's mentioned 5 years and 180,000 kilometers. Or what are the tips that you can give for a fleet manager that would like to know what the ideal mileage and duration is?
So I have one recommendation, which is to be just close to the reality. So we need to take the duration and the mileage which fit to what we need actually. But it's a good question. Thank you, Ante, for that. Because we are, facing some challenges actually, because we know that in some car market and with some also cars, and in particular for LCV, eLCV, we can see that the TCO parity is reached when we increase the duration or the mileage. So it's something which is really interesting, of course. But the big challenge to do that is that we need to align also with OEMs, warranty on the battery. So there is some discussion ongoing. There is no one answer for that. My, recommendation is just to fit to your needs and to check based on that needs, country by country, based on the quotation.
Okay.
And the TCO, with a TCO approach, of course.
Okay, very good. A few other questions that are popping in. Question from Julien Santos. He has a question that he receives from his HR department. Is there a way to ensure that the amount refund for the monthly charging is only done for the company car and not for the other cars?
Yeah, that's a good question. You guys really asking the right questions today when it comes to charging infrastructure. So yes, that's exactly why I was stressing the importance of smart charging. So by having a software layer, like I was saying, on top of your infrastructure, you're able to know which driver groups are charging. So let's say you install one charging station at your workplace. You can create different driver groups: company car drivers, senior management, visitors, employees without company cars. Each of those driver groups can have a different price for that charging station. Perhaps employees charge for free and visitors pay a price. So that's the way you can do it at the workplace. To answer your question about home charging, I would ask, okay, if it's a non-company car driver, why would you be reimbursing their home charging necessarily? So I think the home charging reimbursement is only really relevant if it's a company car whose energy consumption you're trying to pay for. I think in most settings, if it's a non-company car driver, you wouldn't be reimbursing their charging necessarily.
But also for home charging, you can make the distinction between those that are charged for companies and those that are not company cars.
Yes, of course you could. I mean, if you are providing your entire company home charging stations, or you're providing them through a system like ChargePoint and they're connected to our system, you can configure if Group A, the company pays for charging, and Group B, the company doesn't pay for charging. The benefit is you'd obviously see all charging sessions for all drivers, but you'd only be reimbursing a portion of that. So yes, you could do that, but generally speaking, it's normally only home charging stations provided for drivers with company cars.
Okay. A question from Timothée Geoffroy regarding the financing of those home chargers. Which business model do you see the most? Is it that the employee financed the home charging and benefits from certain tax advantages, incentives, and so on? Is it, for example, that the company rents it or leases it or buys it?
Amélie, would you like to start on, I think the leasing model that you mentioned in your presentation is very relevant there. Okay, then I'll comment on it. So I think when it comes to home charging, there's what obviously ALD can combine that home charging station in the leasing rate of the vehicle, which is there's a public charging service, a home charging station, installation, everything bundled into the lease. What I'm seeing in the market is that is one of the most attractive options because it's turnkey. You don't have to deal with multiple providers, and it's a very smooth integration. The added benefit of that also is you have all of the mobility data coming into your fleet from ALD's tools, and then you also have all the charging data coming together. So you have kind of one cockpit to manage both energy consumption, regardless if it's home, workplace, or public, and also your vehicle data. Of course, there's outright purchasing of home charging stations, but then you also get a lot of questions like what happens after the leasing rate of that vehicle, what if they leave the company, etc.
On this point, if I can comment, Timothée, our business model and the one who is famous, toward our client, is the company, rents the home charger as part of the lease price. So it's a bundle solution. And as is, it's really simple for the company and for ALD as well, and of course for the employer.
Okay, Very good. A question from Sophie Paashuizen. How can we ensure that employees reimbursed for the total charging cost and also on a regular basis, since sometimes the invoice of the energy supplier will be sent only once a year or a few times a year, and the reimbursement in principle is done every month? So the real invoice price might be a lot more than what has been reimbursed or vice versa. Is there a recommendation?
Yeah, I think it is a complex topic there, and I'm glad that question is coming because it is a topic where we're also investigating how can we deal with, for example, energy tariffs that fluctuate day by day. For example, in the UK, it's very common to have energy tariffs that fluctuate very much, like gas prices here in Germany every 12 minutes. So I think what's going to be required there is some sort of live integration and understanding what the energy rate is. But that's the future. What we're trying to solve now is to make sure that your employees are fairly reimbursed for the energy they're consuming. And we make sure that you have every opportunity to communicate the appropriate car policy, charging policy, fueling policy to your drivers. If that's checking their utility bill, mandating honesty, it seems to work very well. But right now there are some dynamic tariffs where I think the industry is still working on the perfect solution there. I'd like to, while I'm speaking, I saw a question about Eichrecht compliance as well. I know that's top of the mind in Germany. Eichrecht, for those that don't know, but since we're pan-European fleet managers here, I think it's relevant. Eichrecht is a specific metering law in Germany. And everything that is communicating a specific value, whether it be liters or kilowatts in Germany, needs to be Eicht if it's being used in a commercial setting. So yes, if you're doing home energy reimbursement in Germany, it needs to be an Eichrecht compliant home charging station. Otherwise, finance authorities could come to you and ask, okay, you're reimbursing thousands of kilowatt hours to your drivers. Are those kilowatt hours measured with an Eichrecht compliant meter? Yes or no? So I highly advise that.
Okay. A question from Jose Guillerme. It's related to driver training. He is saying that, of course, if you would like to create fleet efficiency, lower costs, etc., you do that normally with a few steps that you can do. And with ICE cars, for example, also look at driver training so that they have the good behavior, etc. He says, well, perhaps with electric vehicles, there is already that awareness and about range autonomy, range anxiety. So perhaps drivers are automatically adapting their driving style. Is it then not necessary anymore to provide driver training, or is it still?
I think it's still, the case. What we recommend is to have, two training pills in the driver journey. Before he start, before the selection of his new vehicle, to select the right, powertrain, and then when he will select it, when he will wait the delivery, to better understand the good, tips. And to do that, we have, in some country, built some, video, and also we support clients on webinar with, documentation for the driver. And I think it's really, really key step to, facilitate the change management. Just an example, internally, we are, building some video also to train all our community on electrification. And I think it's key to increase awareness on electrification and to have an answer to all these questions.
Okay. Frederic, a question related to your geographic scope I see coming in. I know ChargePoint is originally a US-based company. You also have activities here in Europe. Are you also in other regions, for example, Latin America, as indicated here in the chat?
Yeah, I just had quickly tried to respond to that also in the chat, so beat me to it. But currently, we're not present in Latin America. ChargePoint is available or is present with our full suite of services, hardware, software, services, installation in the US and Canada and 14 European countries. So feel free to reach out to me in detail if you want an exact list. I'm happy to walk you through that.
Okay.
And if I can also comment on this one, ChargePoint has just released the fact that they have partnered with Wills Dunlop. So we are really happy to also cover.
Congratulations.
Yes, this partnership also in the US and Canada.
Okay, and then on your partnership, assuming that most people here in the audience are based in Europe, is your solution, is the collaboration, the partnership between ALD and ChargePoint, is that available in all European countries? Can you elaborate on that? Are there countries that are not yet implemented or in place that will come this year?
Amélie?
Today we have six European countries covered with this partnership, but the ambition of both entities is to roll out that in more and more countries for sure.
Very good. Then we are going to end this webinar here. It's 4:00 in the afternoon CET. We started 1 hour ago. There were plenty of questions, so thank you very much for your interaction and your participation. And for sure, thank you to Amélie de Valroger and Frederic Wagner for the excellent presentation and also answering your questions. As you see, there will be a recorded version of the webinar, so you can relive the expertise of our presenters afterwards on our website. And if you have questions related to electrification, sustainability, and how that matches with cost savings in 2022, you can, of course, reach out to ALD and ChargePoint. I would like to thank everyone and then also invite you to our Connected Fleets conference, where also ALD will be a partner. We organized that in March, and you see on the screen that we will continue there our discovery around sustainability in 2022. We will talk about the relationship between sustainability and connectivity. We also saw today that they go hand in hand. And so we invite you to register on our website, conference.fleeteurope.com. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you in a future initiative of Fleet Europe. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.